The screen tore through the palace hallway just after midnight, and Edmund Hale froze with his hand still on the door handle. He had been told never to move after dark. He had been told never to speak after dark. But no one had told him what to do when a child's voice cried out in pain from behind a locked door, and every instinct in his body pulled him toward it. 3 months earlier, Edmund had walked into this same palace with nothing but a worn leather bag and a letter of recommendation from his old university. He was 26 years old, thin from years of eating little, and desperate for steady work. The letter had come from a distant cousin who served in the royal household, and it promised him a position that most scholars would have begged for, private tutor to a young duke. He remembered the morning he arrived. The palace gates were taller than any building he had ever lived in, and the guards who opened them barely looked at him before waving him through, as if a poor tutor was beneath their notice. Edmund did not mind. He was too busy staring at the gardens, the fountains, and the long stone path that led to the front doors of Ashcombe Palace, home of the Duke's family for nearly 200 years. A servant named Clara met him at the entrance. She was young, with kind eyes and a quick way of speaking, and she led him through corridors lined with paintings of stern-faced ancestors. "The Duchess Dowager will see you first," Clara said. "She is very particular about the household rules. Please listen carefully to everything she tells you." Edmund nodded, though he did not yet understand why a simple tutoring position would come with so many warnings. He was shown into a large sitting room with tall windows and dark wooden furniture. An older woman sat near the fireplace, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. This was Duchess Eleanor, grandmother to the young duke and the true authority of the household since her son and his wife had died several years earlier. "Mr. Hale," she said, without rising. "Sit down." Edmund sat. "You come highly recommended," she continued. "My grandson needs a tutor who can teach him history, mathematics, and the manners expected of a future duke. He is a bright boy. You should find the work rewarding." "Thank you, Your Grace. I will do my best." "There is one rule," she said, and her voice changed slightly, growing quieter and more serious. "One rule that you must follow without question, without exception, for as long as you remain in this house." Edmund waited. "After the sun sets, you are never to speak to my grandson. Not a word, not a greeting, not even his name. If you see him in the evening or at night, you will look away and continue with whatever you are doing. You will not ask him questions. You will not answer if he speaks to you. Do you understand?" Edmund blinked. It was such a strange request that for a moment he thought he had misheard her. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but may I ask why?" The Duchess's expression did not change, but something in her eyes grew distant, as though she were looking at a memory rather than at him. "You may not," she said. "You will simply obey, or you will not stay in this house. Those are the only two choices available to you." Edmund thought of his empty purse, his small rented room in the city, and the letters from his landlord asking for payment he did not have. He thought of his mother, who had raised him alone and always told him that a good position was worth almost any sacrifice. "I understand," he said. "I will follow the rule." The Duchess studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he truly meant it. Then she nodded once, and the matter was closed. "Clara will show you to your quarters. You will begin lessons with Alaric tomorrow morning." That was how Edmund Hale became the private tutor to Duke Alaric, heir to Ashcombe, and how he agreed to a rule he did not understand and would spend the following weeks trying desperately to make sense of. The next morning, Edmund met his student for the first time, and any worry he carried from the strange warning melted away almost immediately. Alaric was 12 years old, with dark curling hair and an easy smile that seemed too warm for a boy raised in such a formal house. He greeted Edmund with genuine curiosity, asking about the books piled in his tutor's arms before either of them had even sat down. "Is that a book about the stars?" Alaric asked, pointing to a slim volume near the top of the stack. "It is," Edmund said, surprised. "You know something of astronomy?" "A little. I like to look at the sky sometimes. There is a good view from the East Tower. Perhaps we shall study it properly then, if you find it interesting." Alaric's smile widened, and for the rest of the morning, Edmund forgot entirely about the Duchess's strange rule. The boy was clever, asking sharp questions and remembering facts easily. He was polite without being stiff, and he laughed at Edmund's small jokes in a way that made the lessons feel less like work and more like conversation between friends. By the end of the first week, Edmund found himself looking forward to each morning. Alaric would greet him at the door of the study room with some new question he had thought of overnight, usually about history or the mechanics of the world, and the two of them would spend hours working through problems together. Edmund began to think that perhaps this position, strange rule and all, might be the best one he had ever held. But as the days turned into a second week, Edmund began to notice something odd about his student. Alaric was bright and cheerful every single morning, without fail, but as afternoon turned into evening, something in him seemed to shift. His answers grew shorter. His eyes would drift toward the windows, watching the light fade outside, and a kind of restlessness would settle over him that had not been there earlier in the day. By the time the sun set, Alaric would ask to be excused, always with the same polite words, and would disappear down the hallway toward the private wing of the palace where Edmund was not permitted to follow. At first, Edmund thought little of it. Children grew tired in the evenings, and perhaps the Duke's household simply had strict routines about bedtime. But then the sounds began. It happened first about 2 weeks into his position. Edmund had stayed late in the study room, grading a set of essays Alaric had written about the founding of the kingdom, when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside. He assumed it was Clara or another servant making their rounds, but when he glanced up, he saw a shadow pass beneath the door, moving slowly, almost hesitantly, toward the east wing. He told himself it was nothing. He returned to his work, but a moment later he heard something that made the hair on his arms rise. A voice, faint and muffled through the thick palace walls, speaking in low tones. It did not sound like any of the servants he had met. It was younger, and there was something strange about its rhythm, as though it were answering questions that only it could hear. Edmund sat perfectly still, remembering the Duchess's warning. He did not move. He did not follow the sound. He simply listened until it faded away into silence, and then he gathered his papers and returned to his own room, his mind full of questions he knew better than to ask aloud. Over the following nights, the pattern repeated itself. Edmund would finish his work in the study, and as darkness settled over the palace, he would hear soft footsteps, distant murmurs, sometimes what sounded like two voices speaking quietly to one another. Though he never saw more than a single shadow pass beneath any door, he began to notice that the servants too grew quieter after dark. Clara, who had been so open and friendly during the day, would grow tense and hurried in her movements once evening arrived, refusing to meet his eyes when he passed her in the corridor. One evening, driven by curiosity he could no longer ignore, Edmund asked her directly, "Clara, is there something happening in this house after dark that I should know about?" Clara's face went pale, and she glanced quickly over her shoulder before answering. "I cannot speak of it, Mr. Hale. Please do not ask me again. It is for the boy's own good, and for yours as well, that you leave things as they are." "The boy's own good," Edmund repeated. "You mean Alaric?" "I have said too much already." Clara hurried away, before he could press further, leaving Edmund standing alone in the hallway, with more questions than he had begun with. That night, unable to sleep, Edmund found a small notebook among his belongings and began to write down everything he had observed, the pattern of Alaric's behavior, cheerful in the morning and distant by evening, the sounds in the hallway after dark, the fear in Clara's eyes whenever the subject was raised. He did not know what any of it meant, but he had spent enough years as a scholar to understand that patterns, once recorded carefully, often revealed truths that scattered observations could not. He wrote by candlelight, filling page after page, and as he wrote, he made a private promise to himself. He would keep the rule, exactly as the Duchess had demanded. He would not speak to Alaric after dark, no matter what he heard or saw, but he would watch, he would listen, and one day, he would understand the truth of what happened in Ashcombe Palace once the sun went down. He had no way of knowing, as he blew out his candle and lay down to sleep, that the truth was closer and stranger than anything he could have imagined, and that the night he finally broke his promise would change not only his own life, but the fate of the entire household. Autumn settled over Ashcombe Palace, bringing shorter days and colder winds that rattled the tall windows of the study room. Edmund had now been in the household for nearly 2 months, and though his days with Alaric remained as warm and rewarding as ever, the nights continued to trouble him in ways he could not shake. He had grown careful in his observations, never letting his curiosity show openly, never asking the servants direct questions after Clara's warning. Instead, he watched quietly, the way a scholar studies an old text, searching for patterns hidden beneath the surface. And slowly, over many weeks, the patterns began to take a clearer shape. Alaric was never seen outside his private chambers after dark, except on the rare occasions when Edmund glimpsed him moving swiftly down the east corridor, always alone, always heading toward the old tower at the far end of the palace. The tower itself was a mystery. It was the oldest part of the building, built long before the rest of the estate, and its narrow windows were always dark, its heavy door always locked. Edmund had asked once, casually, what the tower was used for, and Clara had simply said it was closed for repairs and changed the subject before he could ask more. But the sounds continued. Some nights Edmund heard nothing at all, only the ordinary creaks and settling of an old house. Other nights the murmuring returned, sometimes low and calm, sometimes edged with what sounded like distress. Twice, he heard something that chilled him more than anything else, the sound of Alaric's voice, unmistakable even through the thick stone walls, speaking to someone in a tone Edmund had never heard him use during the day. It was pleading, almost desperate. He wanted, more than anything, to knock on that tower door and ask what was wrong. But every time the urge rose in him, he remembered the Duchess's face when she had given him the rule, the seriousness in her voice, the way she had said obey or leave as though there were no other choice in the world. So he stayed in his room, notebook in hand, recording what little he could piece together, and waited for morning, when Alaric would appear at breakfast bright and smiling, as though nothing at all had happened the night before. It was during this time that Edmund began to notice a man he had not seen before, a visitor to the palace who arrived every few days and spent long hours in private conversation with the Duchess. He was tall, with sharp features and a way of walking that suggested he expected every door to open for him without asking. Clara told Edmund, with obvious reluctance, that his name was Lord Bertram, a distant cousin of the late Duke, and that he had some claim to the family's affairs, though what that claim involved, she would not say. Edmund found himself watching Lord Bertram with the same careful attention he gave to the nighttime sounds. There was something in the man's manner that unsettled him, a coldness behind his polite smiles, a way of glancing at Alaric during the rare moments they crossed paths, that made Edmund think of a merchant assessing a piece of property, rather than a relative regarding a child. One afternoon, Edmund happened to pass an open door near the Duchess's private study, and overheard a fragment of conversation before he could politely withdraw. "The boy grows older every year," Lord Bertram was saying, his voice low, but carrying easily in the quiet hallway. "How much longer do you believe you can keep this arrangement hidden? Servants talk, Eleanor. Tutors ask questions. Sooner or later someone will see what you have been so careful to conceal, and when they do, the consequences will fall on this entire family." "You need not remind me of the risks," the Duchess replied, her voice tight with an anger Edmund had never heard from her before. "I have carried this burden for 12 years. I will continue to carry it for as long as necessary, and you will not speak of it again unless I ask you to. I only wish to help protect what remains of this family's position," Lord Bertram said smoothly. "Should the truth ever come to light in the wrong way, it is not only the boy who will suffer for it." Edmund did not wait to hear more. He moved quickly and quietly down the hallway before either of them noticed his presence, his heart pounding with the weight of what he had overheard. 12 years. A secret carried for 12 years. Exactly the number of years Alaric had been alive, and a threat, thinly disguised as concern, hanging over the entire household. That night, Edmund could not focus on his own work. He sat at his desk with his notebook open before him, staring at the pages of observations he had gathered, trying to fit the new information into the pattern he had already begun to see. A secret 12 years old, a locked tower, a boy who changed after dark, a cousin with a claim to the family's position, warning of consequences if the truth were discovered. He thought of the old laws he had studied during his years at university, the kind of inheritance rules that govern noble families like the Dukes. He remembered, vaguely, a principle observed by some of the oldest houses in the kingdom, that a title could pass to only one heir, and that in certain ancient families, complications arose when more than one child was born who might have a claim to that same title. He had always thought of such laws as historical curiosities, relics from a harsher and more superstitious age. He had never imagined he would find himself living inside a house where such a law might still hold power over a living family. It was pure speculation, he reminded himself. He had no proof of anything beyond a locked tower, a strange rule, and a conversation he had not been meant to hear, but the pieces fit together with an uncomfortable neatness, and the more he turned them over in his mind, the more certain he became that something inside that tower was connected to everything he had witnessed since his first night in the palace. Days passed, and Edmund's restraint began to wear thin. He continued his lessons with Alaric each morning, and the boy remained as warm and clever as ever, seemingly unaware of the storm of questions building in his tutor's mind. But Edmund noticed something new now that he had not paid attention to before. Small marks of exhaustion beneath Alaric's eyes some mornings, a faint unsteadiness in his hands when he held his pen, as though whatever happened to him each night was taking a toll that no amount of daylight cheerfulness could fully hide. One morning, as they worked through a lesson on ancient law, Edmund found himself unable to resist a careful, indirect question. "Alaric," he said, keeping his tone light, "have you ever studied the old inheritance customs? Some noble families in earlier centuries had very strict rules about who could hold a title." Something flickered across Alaric's face, there and gone so quickly that Edmund almost doubted he had seen it at all. but the boy's easy smile faltered for just a moment before returning. "I have read a little about it," Alaric said carefully. "It is a strange old custom. I am glad such things are less common now." "Less common," Edmund repeated gently, "but not entirely gone." Alaric did not answer. He looked down at his book, his jaw tight, and Edmund understood in that moment that he had touched something real, something the boy was not permitted to discuss, any more than Edmund was permitted to speak to him after dark. He did not press further. He simply returned to the lesson, but the exchange stayed with him for the rest of the day, confirming what he had begun to suspect, that the secret hidden in the tower, whatever it truly was, belonged to Alaric as much as it belonged to the family that guarded it so carefully. The turning point came on a night in late autumn, when a storm rolled in over the palace grounds, rattling the windows and filling the halls with the sound of wind and rain. Edmund had stayed later than usual in the study room, working by candlelight on a set of lessons for the following week, when he heard something different from the usual quiet murmurs of the tower. It was a cry, sharp, sudden, and unmistakably filled with pain. Edmund's pen fell from his hand. He sat frozen for a long moment, listening, hoping desperately that he had imagined it, that the storm outside had played some trick on his ears. But then it came again, louder this time, and beneath it, he heard Alaric's voice, choked with fear, calling out words that Edmund could not quite make out through the thick stone walls. Every rule the Duchess had given him screamed in his mind. Do not speak to him after dark. Do not ask questions, obey, or leave. But beneath those rules, something stronger rose in Edmund, something that had grown steadily over the past 2 months of quiet observation, careful patience, and genuine affection for the bright, curious boy he had come to know and admire. He could not sit still while a child cried out in pain behind a locked door, rule or no rule. Edmund rose from his desk, his candle flickering wildly in the drafts that swept through the corridor as he stepped outside the study room. The hallway toward the east wing stretched dark and empty before him, lit only by the occasional flash of lightning through the tall windows. He walked quickly, his heart hammering, every instinct telling him to turn back even as his feet carried him forward. By the time he reached the corridor outside the tower, the storm had grown fierce, and the sound of Alaric's voice, now clearer, filled him with a fear he had never known in all his quiet years of scholarship. "Please," the boy was saying, his voice raw and desperate. "Please, not tonight. I cannot bear it tonight." Edmund stood before the heavy tower door, his hand hovering just above the old iron handle, caught between 2 years of careful discipline and the simple, overwhelming instinct to help a child in distress. Behind him he heard fast footsteps approaching, and he turned to see Clara rushing down the hallway, her face white with alarm, a lantern shaking in her hand. "Mr. Hale," she gasped, "you must not be here. Please, go back to your room before—" But it was already too late. From somewhere deep inside the tower, Alaric's voice rose one final time, breaking into something that was not quite a word, and not quite a sob, and Edmund, without fully deciding to do it, without weighing the consequences one final time, called out his student's name into the storm-filled darkness. "Alaric." The word left his mouth before he could stop it, carried by the wind through the old stone corridor, and the moment it did, everything in the tower fell suddenly, completely silent. For a moment, nothing happened at all. The wind howled outside, rain lashed against the narrow tower windows, and Edmund stood frozen with his hand still raised, as though the sound of his own voice had turned to ice in the air around him. Clara stared at him with wide, horrified eyes, the lantern trembling so badly in her grip that the light danced wildly across the stone walls. "What have you done?" she whispered. Before Edmund could answer, heavy footsteps thundered down the corridor behind them. He turned to see Duchess Eleanor herself, moving faster than he had ever seen her move, a shawl thrown hastily over her nightgown, her silver hair loose around her shoulders for the first time since he had arrived at the palace. Behind her came 2 guards carrying lanterns, and behind them, moving with unhurried, deliberate steps that seemed almost worse than the guards' urgency, came Lord Bertram, fully dressed despite the late hour, as though he had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Open the door," the Duchess commanded, her voice cracking with an emotion Edmund had never heard from her, somewhere between fury and pure terror. One of the guards produced a heavy iron key and fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking nearly as badly as Clara's. "Your Grace, I am sorry," Edmund began. "I heard him crying out. I could not simply—" "Not now," the Duchess snapped, cutting him off without even looking at him. The lock gave way with a heavy click, and the guard threw the door open. What Edmund saw inside the tower room would stay with him for the rest of his life. The chamber was small but comfortably furnished, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and shelves lined with books much like the ones Edmund used in his own lessons. But none of that mattered in the first instant, because on the floor beside the bed lay Alaric, pale and still, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. And kneeling beside him, gripping his hand with desperate strength, was another boy. A boy who looked exactly like Alaric. The same dark curling hair, the same features, though thinner and paler, as though this second boy had spent far less time beneath open sky. He looked up at the sudden crowd of adults filling the doorway with wide, frightened eyes, and in that single frozen moment, Edmund understood, with the force of a physical blow, precisely what the tower had been hiding all along. "Cassian," the Duchess breathed, rushing past Edmund into the room, and dropping to her knees beside both boys. "What happened? Tell me what happened." "He collapsed," the second boy, Cassian said, his voice trembling. "He said his chest hurt, and then he just fell, and I could not wake him, and I called for help, but no one came, and then I heard someone shout his name and I did not know what to do." The Duchess pressed her fingers to Alaric's throat, checking for his pulse with the practiced speed of someone who had done this before, many times, over many years. "He is alive," she said, relief flooding her voice. "Fetch Dr. Bennett immediately. Now, before another moment passes." One of the guards turned and ran, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. The other remained at the door, uncertain, glancing between the Duchess, the two identical boys, and the tutor who was clearly not supposed to be witnessing any of this. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her lantern still shaking, tears now streaming silently down her face. Edmund could not move. He stared at Cassian, at the impossible fact of a second boy who might have been Alaric's exact reflection, and felt the careful, patient theory he had built in his notebook over the past weeks collapse and rebuild itself into something far stranger and more real than he had ever allowed himself to fully believe. "You knew," came a voice from behind him. Cold and satisfied, Edmund turned to find Lord Bertram standing in the corridor, his arms crossed, a thin smile playing at the corner of his mouth as he studied the scene inside the tower room. "Or you suspected, at least. I could see it on your face for weeks, Tutor. All those careful questions about inheritance law. You are cleverer than you let on." "Bertram," the Duchess said sharply, not looking up from Alaric's still form. "This is neither the time nor the place." "On the contrary," Lord Bertram said, stepping into the doorway, his eyes moving from one twin to the other with open calculation. "I believe this is precisely the time. 2 living sons from the same birth, both bearing a legitimate claim to the Ashcombe title. The old succession law is quite clear on the matter, is it not? Only one heir may be recognized. The Crown has enforced that law strictly for generations, and any family found concealing a second heir has faced severe consequences. Loss of title, loss of lands. In the harshest cases, the Crown has taken custody of the concealed child entirely, removing him from his family forever." Edmund felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the storm outside. He looked at Cassian, still kneeling beside his unconscious brother, his thin frame trembling, and understood at last the true weight of the rule he had been given on his very first day in the household. Speak to Alaric after dark, and he might, in some unguarded moment, learn of Cassian's existence. And once a tutor knew, once anyone outside the family's closest, most trusted circle knew, the secret that had protected both boys for 12 years would no longer be safe. "You would not dare report this," the Duchess said, rising to her feet and facing Lord Bertram directly, her voice low and dangerous. "You are family. Whatever quarrel you hold with me, these are innocent children." "I hold no quarrel with you, Eleanor," Lord Bertram said smoothly. "I hold only a natural interest in seeing this family's affairs properly settled. Should the Crown learn that Ashcombe has concealed an illegal heir for 12 years, the title would very likely pass to the next legitimate claimant. As it happens, I am that claimant." His smile widened slightly. "I have been patient. I have waited quietly for years, hoping you might see reason and make some arrangement that protected us both. But you have given me nothing, and now, quite by accident, the tutor you hired has handed me exactly the proof I required." "You would destroy 2 children's lives for a title," Edmund said, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them, anger overtaking the fear that had gripped him since the door had first opened. Lord Bertram turned his cold gaze on him. "I would remind you, Tutor, that you are the one who broke the rule tonight. Whatever happens next, the fault begins with you." The words struck Edmund like a blow, and for a terrible moment, he believed them completely. He had broken his promise. He had let his instincts override his discipline, and now, because of that single choice, Everything the Duchess had worked so hard to protect stood on the edge of collapse. But before he could speak again, running footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Dr. Bennet arrived, breathless, his bag already open in his hands. He pushed past the guard without ceremony and knelt beside Alaric, his fingers moving quickly and expertly over the boy's wrist, his throat, his forehead. His heart is racing far too fast, the doctor said. This is not the first time this has happened, is it, Your Grace? No, the Duchess admitted quietly. It is the third time this year. The strain of these nights is wearing on him more than either of us wishes to admit, Dr. Bennet said, already reaching into his bag for a small vial of medicine. He needs rest, quiet, and far less of whatever burden has been placed on him lately. As the doctor worked, Cassian remained pressed close to his brother's side, refusing to move even when the Duchess gently urged him back to give the physician room. Edmund watched the boy's face, so achingly similar to Alaric's, and yet marked by a different kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had spent his entire life hidden away, never permitted to see the sun, never permitted to walk freely through the gardens Edmund had admired on his very first day at Ashcombe. What happens to him now? Edmund asked quietly, nodding toward the boy. To Cassian, I mean, now that Lord Bertram knows. The Duchess did not answer immediately. She watched the doctor administer the medicine to Alaric, watched her grandson's breathing slowly begin to steady, and only then did she turn to face Lord Bertram directly. Her expression hardened into something fierce and unyielding. You will not report this, she said. I do not care what claim you believe you hold. I will find a way to protect both of these boys, whatever it costs me, and if you attempt to take either of them from this house, you will find that I am not nearly as helpless as you seem to believe. Bold words, Eleanor, Lord Bertram said, unmoved. But words will not stop the truth from reaching the royal council. I have already sent word to a contact within the Crown's household. By morning, officials will be on their way to Ashcombe to investigate the matter personally. There is nothing you can do now to undo what has already been set in motion. A heavy silence fell over the tower room, broken only by Alaric's slow, steadying breaths and the sound of rain against the windows. Edmund watched the color drain from the Duchess's face as the full weight of Lord Bertram's words settled over her, and he understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that the quiet, careful life this family had built to protect two innocent boys was about to be torn apart within a matter of hours, and that he himself, however unintentionally, had been the one to set the final piece in motion. Cassian looked up from his brother's side, his frightened eyes moving from the Duchess to Lord Bertram to Edmund, and in a small, trembling voice, he asked the question that none of the adults in the room seemed able to answer. Are they going to take me away? No one spoke. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere beyond the tower walls, riders were already preparing to carry word of Ashcombe's hidden secret toward the Crown, setting in motion a chain of events that none of them, not the Duchess, not Lord Bertram, and certainly not Edmund himself, would be able to fully control once the sun rose the next morning. Edmund did not sleep that night. Long after the doctor had settled Alaric into a calm, medicated rest, and the Duchess had reluctantly allowed Cassian to be moved to a small adjoining room within the tower, Edmund returned to his own quarters, lit every candle he owned, and pulled every book on inheritance law from the small shelf he had brought with him from university. He was a scholar first, before anything else, and scholarship had taught him one important lesson above all others. Laws, even old and rigid ones, were rarely as simple as they first appeared. Somewhere in the dense, dusty language of centuries-old decrees, there might be a thread worth pulling, a detail that Lord Bertram, in his eagerness for the title, had either overlooked or chosen to ignore. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through his window, Edmund had found something. He hurried to the Duchess's private study, where he found her already awake, seated at her desk, her face drawn with exhaustion but her posture as rigid and composed as it had been on the day they first met. She looked up as he entered, unannounced and breathless, and something in her expression suggested she was too tired to scold him for it. Your Grace, Edmund said, laying an old leather-bound book on the desk before her, open to a page he had marked with a strip of ribbon. I believe I may have found something that could help us. The Duchess studied the page with visible skepticism, but she read carefully, and as she did, her expression shifted from doubt to something more cautious, more hopeful. The succession law, Edmund explained, was written nearly 300 years ago, during a time when the greatest threat to noble titles came from disputes between sons of different marriages, particularly in cases where a nobleman had taken more than one wife in secret. The law was designed to prevent exactly that kind of conflict, ensuring only one legitimate heir could be recognized from a single father. But there is a recorded case here, from just over a century ago, involving twin sons born to a single mother, in a single birth, within a single lawful marriage. The court at the time ruled that the law's original purpose did not apply to true twins, since both children shared the same claim through the same parents at the same moment, and there could be no dispute over legitimacy between them. The Duchess read the passage twice, her lips moving slightly as she traced the old legal language with one finger. And the Crown recognized this ruling? It appears so, Edmund said, though it seems the case was quietly settled and rarely spoken of afterward, likely because the family involved had no wish to draw further attention to the matter. But the precedent exists. If it was accepted once, it could be argued again. For the first time since Edmund had arrived at Ashcombe, he saw something like genuine hope flicker across the Duchess's tired face. "It is not proof," she said carefully. "It is an argument, a thin one, built on a single old case that a hostile magistrate could easily dismiss if he wished to." "It is more than we had an hour ago," Edmund said. "And if we can reach the Crown's representatives before Lord Bertram's version of events reaches them first, we may be able to present our case on our own terms, rather than defending ourselves against accusations already shaped by his ambition." The Duchess rose from her desk, moving with sudden purpose despite her exhaustion. "Lord Bertram said officials would arrive by morning. If we wait for them here, we surrender the advantage of speaking first. We must go to them instead, and we must go now, before the sun is fully risen." Within the hour, the household had been thrown into careful, urgent motion. Dr. Bennet insisted firmly that Alaric was in no condition to travel, his heart still recovering from the strain of the previous night, and so it was decided that he would remain at the palace under Clara's watchful care, while the Duchess, Cassian, and Edmund himself would travel toward the nearest Crown outpost, a full day's ride away, where the regional magistrate held authority to receive urgent petitions before they were forwarded to the Royal Council itself. Cassian, pale and nervous, dressed quickly in traveling clothes that Edmund suspected had been prepared for exactly this kind of emergency long before that night, tucked away in some hidden chest for years in case the family's carefully guarded secret was ever threatened. As they gathered in the courtyard, the boy looked up at the open sky above the palace grounds, with an expression Edmund would never forget: wonder, mixed with fear, as though he could not quite believe he was truly permitted to stand beneath it in the light of morning. "I have never left the palace before," Cassian admitted quietly, as Edmund helped him into the carriage. "Not once, in 12 years. "Then let us hope," Edmund said gently, settling into the seat across from him, "that today marks the beginning of many more journeys for you, rather than the end of your freedom entirely." The carriage set off at a demanding pace, the Duchess's coachman driving the horses hard along the muddy roads left slick from the previous night's storm. Edmund watched Cassian's face throughout the journey, the boy's eyes wide and hungry for every detail of the passing countryside: farmhouses, distant hills, other travelers on the road, small ordinary sights that Alaric had likely taken entirely for granted his whole life. It struck Edmund, watching him, just how much had been taken from this child in the name of protecting a title, and how urgently that wrong needed to be set right, whatever the law ultimately decided. They stopped only twice to change horses, the Duchess growing more anxious with each passing hour, glancing repeatedly at the road behind them as though expecting Lord Bertram's messengers to appear at any moment. Edmund used the long hours of travel to prepare his argument as carefully as he could, reviewing the old legal case again and again, searching for weaknesses in his own reasoning before a hostile magistrate could find them first. They reached the Crown outpost as the sun began to lower toward the horizon, the sky streaked with orange and deep gold above a modest stone building that served as the regional seat of royal authority. A handful of mounted guards stood near the entrance, and Edmund's stomach tightened at the sight of them, unsure whether they were simply the outpost's usual garrison, or had already been summoned in response to Lord Bertram's warning. The Duchess stepped down from the carriage first, drawing herself up to her full, formal height despite the exhaustion clearly written across her face, and approached the guards with the same commanding presence Edmund had witnessed on his very first day at Ashcombe. "I am Duchess Eleanor of Ashcombe," she announced. "I request an urgent audience with Magistrate Holloway regarding a matter of succession law that requires his immediate attention." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for a noblewoman of the Duchess's standing to arrive unannounced and demanding entry. After a tense moment of hesitation, one of them disappeared inside the building, and several long minutes passed before he returned, gesturing for them to follow him into the cool stone corridors within. Magistrate Holloway proved to be an older man with sharp, appraising eyes and a manner that gave away nothing of his thoughts as the Duchess, with Edmund's careful assistance, laid out the situation before him: the birth of twin sons 12 years earlier, the family's decision to conceal the second child out of fear of the ancient succession law, and now, the urgent threat posed by a relative eager to use that same law for his own gain. The magistrate listened in near total silence, his expression unreadable, occasionally glancing toward Cassian, who stood quietly beside Edmund, doing his best to appear brave despite the trembling Edmund could see in his hands. When the Duchess finished, the magistrate was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "This is a serious matter, Your Grace. Concealment of a legitimate heir is not a small offense in the eyes of the Crown, whatever your reasons for it may have been." He turned his gaze toward Edmund. "And you, sir. I understand you are the one who first discovered the boy's existence, and that a formal report has already been sent ahead of you by Lord Bertram of Ashcombe." "That is correct," Edmund said carefully, "but I believe, with respect, that the law in question may not apply as simply as Lord Bertram wishes it to." He presented his argument then, laying out the old legal case as clearly and persuasively as he could, watching the magistrate's face carefully for any sign of how his words were being received. When he finished, a heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the distant sound of horses in the courtyard outside. "An interesting argument," the magistrate said finally, "and not without merit, though I confess I am not familiar with the case you describe. I will need to review the matter personally, and consult with the Royal Archives before I can offer any judgment." He rose slowly from his chair. "In the meantime, I will accompany you back to Ashcombe myself, along with a small escort, to examine the situation firsthand, before any further reports reach the Royal Council. It is the fairest course I can offer, given the circumstances." It was not the immediate reassurance the Duchess had hoped for, but it was, Edmund understood, far better than the alternative. As the magistrate began issuing quiet orders to his guards, preparing for the journey back to Ashcombe at first light, Edmund allowed himself, for the first time in nearly a full day, to feel a small, cautious flicker of hope. But as evening settled fully over the outpost and the household prepared for a short, uneasy rest before the return journey, a rider arrived at the gates, breathless and travel-worn, carrying urgent news that would change the course of everything that followed. Lord Bertram, it seemed, had not waited patiently for the Crown's official process to unfold. He had already set out for Ashcombe himself, with men of his own, determined to reach the palace and claim what he believed was rightfully his before the magistrate or anyone else could intervene. There was no time for rest after all. Within minutes of the rider's warning, Magistrate Holloway had gathered his guards and ordered fresh horses prepared, his earlier caution replaced by a brisk, focused urgency that Edmund found strangely reassuring. Whatever the magistrate's private thoughts on the legal question at hand, he clearly had no intention of allowing Lord Bertram to settle the matter through force before the Crown's proper process could take place. "If he reaches Ashcombe first and attempts to remove the boy by his own authority," Holloway said grimly, swinging up onto his horse, "he will find himself guilty of a far graver offense than anything he has accused your family of, Your Grace. Unlawful seizure of a minor is a serious crime, whatever claim a man believes he holds to a title." The Duchess, Edmund, and Cassian returned to the carriage, and the small procession set off into the night at a pace that left Edmund gripping the carriage's edge to steady himself against the jolting road. Cassian sat pressed close to his grandmother's side, his earlier wonder at the open world now replaced by open fear, his eyes fixed on the darkened countryside rushing past the window. "What will happen to my brother?" Cassian asked quietly, "if Lord Bertram reaches him before we do?" "He will not," the Duchess said, with a firmness Edmund suspected was meant as much to reassure herself as to comfort the boy. "Dr. Bennet would not allow strangers near him in his condition, and the household staff know better than to open the gates to Bertram without my permission." But Edmund could see the worry etched deep into her face, and he found himself sharing it fully. Lord Bertram had shown, over the course of that single long day, exactly how far he was willing to go to secure the title he believed belonged to him. A locked gate and a loyal staff seemed, suddenly, like thin protection against a man so clearly determined. They traveled through the night, the magistrate's guards riding alongside the carriage, and reached the outskirts of Ashcombe, just as the first pale light of morning began to touch the horizon. Edmund's exhaustion had long since given way to a kind of sharp, nervous alertness, every sense straining for some sign of what awaited them at the palace. What they found, as the carriage rolled up the long stone drive, was a scene of quiet chaos. Several unfamiliar horses stood tethered near the front steps, their riders nowhere in sight, and the palace's usually calm front doors stood wide open, with two of the household guards positioned tensely just inside, clearly having turned away visitors they had no wish to admit. The Duchess was out of the carriage before it had fully stopped, moving up the steps with a speed that belied her age, Edmund and Cassian close behind her. Inside, they found Clara standing firm at the base of the grand staircase, her arms crossed, blocking the path upward, while Lord Bertram stood before her, his composure finally beginning to crack into open frustration. "Step aside," he was saying, his voice sharp. "I have every right to see the boy and confirm his condition for myself." "You have no such right," Clara replied, her voice trembling but unwavering, "and you will not pass this staircase while I am standing on it." "Bertram," the Duchess called out, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Lord Bertram turned, and for the first time since Edmund had met him, something like genuine surprise crossed his sharp features at the sight of the magistrate's guards filing into the entrance hall behind the Duchess and her party. "Eleanor," he said, recovering his composure quickly, "I see you have brought company." "Magistrate Holloway has agreed to examine this matter personally," the Duchess said, "and to do so properly, through the Crown's lawful process, rather than through whatever scheme you had planned for this morning." Lord Bertram's eyes moved from the Duchess to the magistrate, his expression calculating even as the situation clearly shifted away from his favor. "I have done nothing unlawful," he said carefully. "I have simply come to see my young cousin's welfare confirmed for myself, as any concerned relative might." "At dawn," the magistrate observed dryly, stepping forward, "with 3 armed men, and without any invitation from the household, I have heard a rather different account of your intentions from the rider who reached me last night. Lord Bertram, you would do well to consider your next words carefully." For a long, tense moment, Lord Bertram said nothing at all, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking briefly toward the staircase behind Clara, as though calculating whether he might still find some way to force his way past her before the situation fully slipped beyond his control. But whatever plan he had been forming clearly withered under the combined weight of the magistrate's guards, the Duchess's unwavering resolve, and Clara's own stubborn refusal to yield an inch of ground. "I withdraw nothing," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "The law remains the law, whatever delays you manage to arrange for yourselves." "Indeed it does," Magistrate Holloway said, "which is precisely why I intend to examine the matter thoroughly, beginning this morning, rather than allowing either you or the Duchess to settle it through pressure or force. You will remain here, Lord Bertram, under watch, until my inquiry is complete. Attempting to leave before then will only strengthen my suspicion that your interest in this matter has far less to do with the law than with your own ambitions." Lord Bertram's face darkened, but he said nothing further, and one of the magistrate's guards moved quietly to stand near him, a clear and unmistakable signal that his freedom of movement, for the time being, had come to an end. With the immediate danger contained, the household turned its attention to Alaric, and Edmund followed the Duchess and Cassian up the staircase, his heart still racing from the tension of the confrontation below. They found the young Duke awake, propped up in his bed with pillows, pale but alert, his face lighting with relief the moment he saw his brother rush into the room and gather him carefully into an embrace. "You are well," Cassian said, half laughing, half crying with relief. "I was so afraid, Alaric. I thought—" "I am well enough," Alaric said, though his voice remained weak. "Dr. Bennet has hardly left my side since you departed, and you, brother, have had quite an adventure, I hear, seeing the world beyond these walls at last." For the rest of that day, Magistrate Holloway conducted his inquiry with careful, methodical patience, reviewing Edmund's legal argument, questioning Dr. Bennet about the boy's health and history, and speaking privately and at length with both the Duchess and, eventually, with Alaric and Cassian themselves. Edmund watched from a respectful distance as the twins, together for the first time in the full light of day rather than hidden away after dark, answered the magistrate's questions honestly and openly, their obvious bond and affection for one another plain to see in every exchange. By evening, Magistrate Holloway called the household together in the palace's main hall to deliver his findings. Edmund stood near the back of the room, beside Clara, his heart pounding with anticipation, as the magistrate rose to address them all. "I have examined the legal precedent presented to me," Holloway began, "and I have consulted, as thoroughly as time allowed, with what records I could access regarding the earlier case of twin succession. I find the argument compelling, though not without complications that will require further review by the Royal Council in the coming months. However, I see no immediate cause to remove either child from this household, nor any evidence that the Duchess's actions were driven by anything other than a mother's, and a grandmother's, desperate wish to protect her family." A quiet murmur of relief passed through the gathered household. The Duchess, standing tall and composed once more, allowed herself a small, tired smile, her hand resting gently on Alaric's shoulder as he sat beside her, still recovering but steadily regaining his strength. As for Lord Bertram, the magistrate continued, his tone hardening, his conduct in this matter, arriving here with armed men and attempting to force entry before any lawful inquiry could take place, will be reported to the Royal Council, alongside my own findings. Whatever claim he believed he held to this title, I suspect his actions this morning have done considerably more harm to his position than good. Lord Bertram, seated under guard near the edge of the hall, said nothing, his expression a mask of controlled fury that Edmund suspected would not soften any time soon. But for the first time since Edmund had arrived at Ashcombe, the man's confidence seemed genuinely, visibly shaken. In the weeks that followed, the Royal Council reviewed Magistrate Holloway's report and the old legal precedent Edmund had uncovered, and though the final decision took months to arrive, it ultimately favored the family, recognizing both Alaric and Cassian as true and equal sons of Ashcombe, with careful provisions made to ensure that only one would formally inherit the title itself, while the other would be granted lands and standing of his own, free at last to live openly rather than hidden away after dark. Lord Bertram's ambitions, thoroughly exposed by his own actions, earned him no sympathy from the Crown, and he withdrew from Ashcombe's affairs entirely, his claim quietly and permanently dismissed. For Edmund, the changes that followed were quieter, but no less significant. The strange rule that had first greeted him on his arrival, silence after dark, no matter what he heard or saw, was formally lifted the very evening Magistrate Holloway delivered his findings. From that night onward, Edmund tutored both brothers together, watching with quiet satisfaction as Cassian, freed at last from 12 years of hidden isolation, blossomed into the same bright, curious presence his twin had always been, the two of them often finishing each other's sentences, laughing over the same jokes, and racing each other across the palace gardens in the golden afternoon light neither of them had ever fully known together before. Clara, too, seemed to breathe easier with each passing week, the constant tension that had once tightened her shoulders every evening finally beginning to fade. And the Duchess, though she remained as formal and composed as ever in the eyes of visitors and household staff alike, allowed herself, in quiet moments Edmund occasionally witnessed, small, unguarded smiles as she watched her two grandsons together at last, no longer divided by darkness and secrecy. One evening, many months after that storm-filled night in the tower, Edmund found himself walking the palace gardens after sunset, no longer bound by any rule forbidding him from doing so. He heard familiar voices ahead and found Alaric and Cassian seated together on a stone bench beneath the darkening sky, pointing out constellations to one another exactly as Alaric had once described doing alone, from the narrow window of the east tower. "Mr. Hale," Alaric called, waving him over. "Come and settle an argument for us. Cassian insists that Star there is part of the hunter's belt, but I am quite certain he is mistaken." Edmund smiled, crossing the lawn to join them, and sat down between the two brothers beneath the wide-open sky, no longer needing to guard his silence, no longer needing to hide anything at all. For the first time since he had walked through Ashcombe's gates all those months ago, the darkness held no secrets left to fear, only the quiet, ordinary comfort of two boys, finally free, learning the names of the stars together.